Police say Peterson killed his pregnant wife, Laci, then dumped her body in the San Francisco Bay.
This morning, an exclusive look at A&E's new documentary that examines alternative theories and evidence in the notorious case of Scott Peterson.
For over 2 decades, the disappearance and death of Laci Peterson captivated the nation, branding her husband, Scott Peterson, as the villain. But what if everything we thought we knew was wrong? New forensic science and eyewitness accounts are now emerging that cast doubt on the original timeline and shake the foundation of the conviction. How did critical evidence get overlooked? Why were key leads ignored? The answers are startling and may force a retrial, uncovering a truth far more complicated and darker than the public has ever been told. This is the story that's rewriting the Peterson case in 2026. Doubts over the original timeline. From the start, the timeline surrounding Laci Peterson's disappearance has been foundational to the case against Scott Peterson. Laci vanished on Christmas Eve, and the prosecution insisted she and her unborn son died that very night. However, groundbreaking scientific analysis now challenges this core assumption. New evidence suggests that Laci's son, Connor, likely died several days after December 24th, a discovery that would dramatically alter when Laci herself died. This updated timeline is based largely on advances in fetal development imaging and radiological expertise that simply didn't exist in 2004. A respected Harvard radiologist reviewed the limited fetal remains and concluded that Connor Peterson's death probably occurred between December 28th and early January. This shifts the window of Laci's death away from the originally alleged timeframe and calls into question the entire prosecution timeline. Why does this matter? If Laci was alive days after Scott said she disappeared, it could clear him entirely. The prosecution's narrative hinged on Scott's whereabouts and supposed actions that evening, particularly the claim that he disposed of the bodies soon after Christmas Eve. But if Laci lived longer, Scott's alibi and the evidence supporting guilt become far less convincing. At the time, the jury had no access to this refined scientific analysis. They were compelled to accept testimony based on broader and less precise forensic standards. With new medical insights, that early timeline looks shakier, and reasonable doubt grows. This alone is cause for reconsidering whether justice was truly served. Questions also arise about how this timeline shift escaped notice for so many years. Did investigators overlook or dismiss early signs that contradicted their theory? The possibility that vital clues were ignored feeds into a broader atmosphere of tunnel vision during the original investigation. Importantly, the new timeline doesn't immediately reveal who or what caused Laci's death. That remains a mystery. But it does unravel the tight prosecution case and opens space for alternative explanations. It pushes the entire case back to a question of evidence instead of assumption. This emerging scientific evidence sets the stage for rethinking a case long considered closed. It introduces doubt not just about timing, but about the validity of the entire forensic and circumstantial foundation. And it invites a fresh look at investigations that failed to close critical gaps. While this revelation alone is enormous, it connects with a far more troubling pattern, that of credible eyewitnesses whose testimonies were never properly explored. These voices add urgently needed perspective beyond forensic data. Those eyewitness reports, in fact, may hold the key to understanding what really happened in those uncertain days after Christmas. Eyewitness reports ignored. Shortly after Laci Peterson disappeared, numerous witnesses called police and helplines to report sightings of a woman matching her description. These were not random claims. The accounts shared notable similarities: a pregnant woman with short dark hair struggling to control a golden retriever. The consistency across at least a dozen independent reports lent credibility to the possibility that Laci was alive and seen walking her dog days after the official disappearance date. Despite the importance of these eyewitnesses, investigators failed to pursue these leads adequately. The Modesto police seemingly dismissed these reports because they didn't align with the widely accepted narrative that Scott Peterson was responsible. It appears that once Scott became the prime suspect, other potential theories, including the possibility that Laci was still alive days later, were ignored or sidelined. This dismissal represents a critical investigative oversight. When multiple witnesses tell a coherent story, it should trigger rigorous follow-up rather than being discarded. Ignoring such testimonies blinds investigators to alternative scenarios that could contradict their chosen suspect's involvement. The consequences of this tunnel vision are pretty profound. By excluding these reports, police ended up limiting the scope of the investigation in a way that kind of locked everything into one interpretation based mostly on circumstantial evidence. And it doesn't just feel wrong, it actually not only risked convicting an innocent man, but also left the real circumstances of Laci's fate unresolved, like the question was never fully answered. What's more troubling is that the exclusion of these accounts seems to show a pattern where evidence that didn't really match the prosecution's theory was kind of sidelined. It raises questions about how confirmation bias could have shaped the investigation and how much public pressure ended up steering police priorities, even if they told themselves they were being neutral or measured about it. The failure to follow credible leads also points to a bigger issue. When the media and law enforcement get fixated on one suspect, other viable possibilities fade out of sight, sometimes at the cost of justice. That kind of shift doesn't stop in the moment either. It can leave lasting effects on the fairness of the trial and on the accuracy of the verdict. Ultimately, these eyewitness reports act as a vital reminder that investigations have to stay open-minded, especially when a life and legal liberty hangs in the balance. Their voices deserve to be heard, and their claims should be evaluated seriously, not brushed aside. As doubts grew about critical testimonies, so too did questions about the physical evidence, or startling lack thereof, that was supposed to support the prosecution's case against Scott Peterson. Flaws in forensic evidence. One of the pillars of any criminal case is forensic evidence linking the suspect to the crime. Yet, in Scott Peterson's trial, glaring gaps remain in the physical proof tying him to Laci's disappearance and death. Notably, no forensic traces were found in the 3 key locations alleged by the prosecution: the Peterson home, Scott's truck, and his boat. This absence raises immediate alarms. The prosecution argued that Scott killed Laci at home, transported her body in his truck, and dumped it from his boat into San Francisco Bay. Yet, investigators failed to uncover blood, hair, fibers, or other forensic evidence that would typically be expected in such a grim scenario. For a case built largely on circumstantial evidence, the lack of physical proof is deeply concerning. Critics argue that the forensic investigation was insufficient and poorly handled. Haphazard evidence collection, contamination risks, and rushed analyses all contributed to an incomplete picture. If physical proof was missing at multiple critical points, it weakens the foundation of the prosecution's assertions. The absence of forensic links also amplifies doubts about the timeline and eyewitness testimonies. Without physical evidence anchoring Scott to the crime scene, alternative explanations gain traction. Was the investigation thorough, or did confirmation bias lead investigators to overlook or downplay contradictory material? Compounding the issue, expert testimony sometimes exaggerated the reliability of the forensic evidence presented. Jurors were led to believe that science conclusively confirmed Scott's guilt, when in reality, much of it was circumstantial or based on assumptions rather than hard facts. This gap between claims and reality highlights how the legal system can be swayed by perception rather than substance. In high-profile cases, the pressure to find a culprit can overshadow the need for rigorous proof. Ultimately, the forensic flaws in the Peterson case cast a long shadow over the fairness of the conviction and underscore the critical need for new examination using today's advanced technology and unbiased expertise. Where forensic evidence fails, the influence of expert testimony often fills the void, sometimes to the detriment of justice. Looking back, the forensic shortcomings remain among the most heavily debated aspects of the Peterson case, because physical evidence is often expected to provide the clearest link between a suspect and a crime. When that link is incomplete or entirely absent, every other piece of evidence naturally receives greater scrutiny. Circumstantial cases can certainly result in lawful convictions, but they also demand careful evaluation of every assumption used to connect individual facts into a single narrative. As forensic science continues to advance, techniques unavailable during the original investigation may offer opportunities to clarify questions that once seemed impossible to answer. Whether those developments ultimately reinforce the prosecution's theory or expose significant weaknesses, they represent an important step toward a more accurate understanding of the evidence. In cases carrying consequences this severe, the pursuit of certainty should never stop simply because a verdict has already been reached. The tangled web of expert claims, personal motives, and overlooked clues deepens the mystery surrounding Laci Peterson's fate and Scott Peterson's trial. The role of expert testimony. Expert testimony often carries significant weight in criminal trials, shaping how jurors interpret evidence and construct narratives. In the Peterson case, several expert witnesses played pivotal roles, but later came under scrutiny for the reliability of their claims. One particularly influential expert was called to testify about where Laci Peterson's body was found in San Francisco Bay, linking it directly to the location where Scott Peterson was said to have been fishing that night. This testimony, however, was based more on conjecture than solid expertise. The credibility of this expert's claims has since been questioned because it relied heavily on guesswork rather than concrete scientific data. By lending false authority to uncertain conclusions, the testimony helped bolster the prosecution's theory in ways that may have misled the jury. The problem is not uncommon. When experts speak confidently, jurors often take their word as definitive, even if the underlying evidence is weak or speculative. Furthermore, other experts testified about timeline estimations and forensic findings without the benefit of technological advances that have since emerged. The jury heard assertions grounded in outdated science, which today would be considered questionable or incomplete. These testimonials created a veneer of certainty that obscured the true gaps and inconsistencies in evidence. This highlights a critical vulnerability in the justice system: reliance on expert opinions that seem authoritative but may be flawed or incomplete. If experts overstate their certainty or base conclusions on inconclusive data, it jeopardizes a fair trial. The Peterson case exemplifies how such testimony can disproportionately influence outcomes in high-profile trials. The Los Angeles Innocence Project's recent review argues that the jury's verdict was tainted because critical scientific evidence was either false or misrepresented. It raises constitutional concerns since the defendant's right to a reliable verdict depends on truthful and accurate information being presented in court. When expert testimony crosses this line, it undermines the entire trial's integrity. In hindsight, those expert claims now feel less like objective science and more like narratives crafted to support a predetermined conclusion. The pressure to fill evidentiary gaps may have encouraged witnesses to stretch their interpretations, knowingly or unwittingly aiding the prosecution's agenda. This misuse of expertise ultimately deprived the jury of an honest, unbiased reckoning of the facts. Instead, they were presented with carefully curated but ultimately unreliable opinions. The result is a profound question about whether justice was truly achieved. Such revelations compel us to reconsider not just individual testimonies, but the broader system that elevates experts to near unchallengeable status. The balance between expert knowledge and impartiality is delicate, and when it falters, the consequences can be irreversible. The controversy surrounding expert testimony in the Peterson case extends far beyond a single courtroom. It raises difficult questions about how courts should evaluate scientific opinions as knowledge continues to evolve. What may have appeared convincing decades ago can later be challenged by improved research, better forensic methods, or a deeper understanding of the limits of certain techniques. That reality does not automatically invalidate every past conviction, but it does emphasize the need for ongoing scrutiny whenever credible concerns arise. Experts serve an essential role in helping juries understand complex evidence, yet their conclusions must always remain grounded in verifiable facts rather than confidence alone. When certainty is presented where uncertainty actually exists, the search for truth becomes distorted. Cases like this remind us that justice depends not only on expert credentials, but on transparency, rigorous methodology, and the willingness to question even the most authoritative voices when the evidence demands it. As doubts about expert testimony rise, attention shifts to understanding the man at the center of the case, Scott Peterson, and the complex interplay between his personal life and the public story. Scott Peterson's behavior and motives. Scott Peterson's conduct following Laci's disappearance painted a conflicting portrait that the media and prosecution quickly seized upon. His affair with Amber Frey cast him in a deeply negative light, igniting public suspicion and coloring the narrative of guilt. Descriptions of Scott as a sociopath, pathological liar, and manipulator became widespread, shaping perceptions before the trial even began. The arrest itself added to this image. Scott was found at a golf course in San Diego carrying his brother's ID with a truck full of clothes, close to $15,000 in cash, and new camping gear. His sudden change in appearance and distance from home appeared to some as an attempt to escape the consequences, often interpreted as consciousness of guilt. Yet, these actions, while suspicious, do not constitute direct proof of murder. Legal experts note that Scott's decisions, though ill-advised, could be understood in the context of overwhelming media scrutiny and public vilification. For someone accused in the court of public opinion, attempting to disappear or change one's identity is often a survival tactic, not necessarily an admission of guilt. This nuance was largely lost amid sensational headlines and courtroom drama. Moreover, defense attorneys acknowledge that Scott's affair complicated his case, but argue it distracted from an objective evaluation of evidence. Had he not been involved with another woman, they contend, investigators and jurors might have viewed the circumstances with more skepticism and fairness. Ultimately, Scott carries the burden of his choices, not only failing to be forthcoming, but allowing his personal flaws to dominate the narrative. This has affected both public opinion and, arguably, the legal process itself. It is a reminder that character judgments can profoundly influence how justice unfolds, sometimes overshadowing facts. This complexity underscores how human behavior, emotion, and relationships intersect with law, producing cases that are rarely straightforward. It also highlights dangers in equating personal failings with legal guilt. While Scott's actions are undeniably part of the story, they are only one dimension. The fuller truth requires peeling back layers of evidence, or lack thereof, that were overshadowed by his troubled persona. The tangled mix of personal misconduct and questionable evidence leaves us questioning how much of the conviction was based on fact versus assumption fueled by emotion. Yet, the shadow of the overlooked Medina burglary adds another perplexing piece to the puzzle. The enduring debate surrounding Scott Peterson's behavior serves as a cautionary example of how public perception can become intertwined with legal judgment. A person's moral failures may explain why they are disliked, but they cannot, by themselves, establish criminal responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction lies at the heart of every fair justice system. As investigators, attorneys, and the public continue to revisit this case, separating emotion from evidence remains one of the greatest challenges. The more closely each fact is examined, the clearer it becomes that suspicious conduct and provable guilt are not always the same thing. Whether those differences ultimately change the outcome or reinforce the original verdict, they deserve careful consideration. In a case that has captivated the nation for decades, the search for truth depends not on assumptions about character, but on evidence, capable of standing up to the highest level of legal and scientific scrutiny. As the background of Scott Peterson's conduct brings new light to the human side of the case, it also leads us to consider the ways critical evidence was ignored. The overlooked Medina burglary. One of the most puzzling and troubling aspects surrounding the Laci Peterson investigation is the burglary that occurred directly across the street from the Petersons' home. This crime, initially considered unrelated, surfaced as a critical piece that police inexplicably failed to connect to Laci's disappearance. The burglary involved stolen property and suspicious activity that could have offered vital clues about possible suspects or motivations, yet investigators chose to separate it entirely from the missing person case. Even more concerning is that the Modesto police reportedly changed the date of the Medina burglary after it happened. a move that conveniently distanced it from the timeline of Laci's disappearance. This alteration raises questions about the integrity of the investigation and whether details were manipulated to protect a preferred suspect narrative. When law enforcement agencies adjust key facts, it undermines public trust and suggests a potential cover-up or serious oversight. Further, there is evidence that investigators handling the Medina burglary and those working the Peterson case met and jointly decided to destroy all evidence related to the burglary within months after Laci vanished. Destroying evidence in any criminal investigation is extraordinary, but doing so in a high-profile case invites speculation about whether something was hidden that might have contradicted the official story. This pattern of ignoring or suppressing links between crimes suggests a willful blindness from agencies intent on narrowing the focus onto Scott Peterson alone. Such tunnel vision can derail an investigation by excluding alternative leads and critical information. The burglary case, had it been followed properly, might have offered important breakthroughs or pointed toward unknown suspects. This brings up a kind of question about whether Laci Peterson's disappearance maybe involved more complicated circumstances than what was said out loud. Like, could the timing and location of the burglary suggest involvement by unknown persons who just never got proper attention or scrutiny? And the way things were handled, no transparency really. It keeps pushing frustration for the people who want justice and truth that goes past the whole media spectacle. Also, the fact that the Medina burglary wasn't properly folded into the bigger investigation shows how institutional momentum and confirmation bias can block real, careful police work. When investigators lean on a theory that feels easy or convenient, then some important evidence can just disappear under the surface. That leaves these unanswered gaps, and they end up haunting the case for years. For the Peterson family and the legal advocates, this isn't only procedural. It feels bigger, like a systemic failing that may stop true accountability. Every bit of overlooked evidence is basically a missed chance, a poor avenue to figure out what actually occurred to Laci. In the end, that shadow connected to the Medina burglary adds even more weight to requests for a full reinvestigation. Something that doesn't just accept the simplified conclusion. It should look past the official narrative, with fresh eyes and a more stubborn sense of doubt. Even as questions about ignored evidence deepen, the efforts of dedicated advocates and experts have begun to change the course of this case's troubled history. The Los Angeles Innocence Project's review. The Los Angeles Innocence Project, known for championing wrongful conviction cases, took on the Peterson case with a commitment to uncovering overlooked truths. Over several years, they assembled a team of independent experts representing some of the finest minds in forensic science, law, and criminal investigation. Their mission was to painstakingly analyze every piece of evidence, question assumptions, and test whether the original verdict truly stood on solid ground. Their findings have been nothing short of groundbreaking. The Innocence Project argues that Scott Peterson was wrongly convicted, largely because the jury was influenced by false or misleading evidence, including scientific testimony that modern advancements have since debunked. They contend that Scott's constitutional rights were violated by the introduction of unreliable information that shaped the jury's perception of guilt rather than fact. Central to their case is the revelation that key expert testimony in the original trial was not only flawed, but sometimes outright guesswork. By exposing these errors, the project challenges the foundation of the prosecution's narrative and demands a thorough review by higher courts. Their advocacy aims to ensure that every verdict is based on trustworthy, verifiable evidence. Moreover, their efforts highlight the broader flaws in the justice system, how pressure to resolve high-profile cases can prioritize convictions over actual innocence. The Peterson case becomes emblematic of systemic issues where mistakes and bias lead to potentially devastating outcomes for defendants. Through strict re-examination, the Innocence Project has also spotlighted the dangers tied to media-fueled rushes to judgment. At first, public outrage and sensational reporting fed into a hostile atmosphere, where proper investigation was, quietly compromised. Fixing that really needs both legal and cultural adjustments, something that leans into fairness, but also skepticism. For Scott Peterson, the project's work gives a small glimmer of hope, even while so many people condemn him. His legal team is welcoming this renewed scrutiny, and they seem hopeful that justice can be revisited with modern science and without the usual cloudy analysis. The road ahead includes filing appeals and petitions. Now, the California Supreme Court has 120 days to think about reopening the case. And the implications are not just for one man. This review, in a way, asks all of us to wonder how many other convictions are sitting on shaky ground, influenced by media, by flawed experts, or by incomplete investigations. It is pushing for reform and vigilance to help protect against future injustices that could otherwise slide by. As the legal process starts to mirror these new realities, the Peterson case is far from finished. It now works as a living reminder of the ongoing hunt for truth inside a troubled criminal justice system. Regardless of how the courts ultimately respond, the Los Angeles Innocence Project's involvement has already reshaped the conversation surrounding the case. Instead of asking only whether Scott Peterson is guilty or innocent, attention has shifted toward whether the investigation, forensic evidence, and trial met the highest standards of justice. That distinction matters because public confidence depends not just on reaching a verdict, but on reaching it through a process that can withstand renewed scrutiny. Every new filing, expert review, and judicial decision will likely be examined with greater care than ever before. Whatever conclusion is eventually reached, the Peterson case now stands as a powerful reminder that justice is not a single moment frozen in time. It is an ongoing responsibility that demands transparency, scientific integrity, and the courage to re-examine even the most controversial convictions when credible questions continue to emerge years after the original trial. The deeper the investigation digs, the more the initial certainty around Laci Peterson's disappearance unravels, inviting us to consider how far a flawed system can go. Implications for justice system. The unfolding revelations in the Peterson case expose troubling cracks, not only in a single investigation, but in the American criminal justice system as a whole. When evidence is withheld, key leads ignored, and flawed expert testimony allowed, the foundation of justice is shaken. This case starkly illustrates how critical the system is designed to protect individual rights, but can fail when those safeguards break down. Public pressure and media sensationalism played an outsized role in shaping the Peterson case from the beginning. Once Scott Peterson was painted as the villain, alternative theories and evidence were sidelined. This dynamic warns of how intense media narratives can bias investigations and trials before all facts are fully examined, endangering the presumption of innocence. The failure to thoroughly examine eyewitness accounts or connect crimes like the Medina burglary highlights a systemic problem: confirmation bias. Law enforcement and prosecutors can become so invested in a theory that disconfirming evidence is dismissed or ignored. This tunnel vision not only undermines fairness, but lets the true story remain hidden. Advances in forensic science, absent during the original trial, now spotlight how technology can provide a more reliable measure of truth. The Peterson case underscores the need for continuous re-evaluation of evidence using the latest methods, especially in convictions based mostly on circumstantial or outdated scientific testimony. More important, the case challenges institutions to recognize and correct errors without defensiveness. Like they should, right away, not with all that guarded defensiveness. Upholding justice means committing to re-examination when reasonable doubt comes up, even in those highly charged, notorious cases where everyone is sure and somehow nobody really checks. It tests how the legal system can prioritize truth over finality, and not just keep the narrative tidy. The Los Angeles Innocence Project's involvement symbolizes the vital role of third-party advocacy groups in safeguarding justice, in a way that official channels sometimes forget. When official channels falter, independent scrutiny can be the last hope for people who might be wrongfully convicted. And it also points to stronger mechanisms inside the system to self-correct, to avoid those miscarriages of justice before they actually happen, not after it's too late. Society faces a broader moral imperative from cases like this to balance the desire for swift closure against the essential need for fairness and precision. The cost of failing is both personal and collective. It chips away at faith in legal institutions and can end up condemning innocent lives, even if only indirectly. As technology and awareness evolve, so too must legal standards and cultural attitudes. Increased transparency, accountability, and a bit of skepticism toward definitive claims in high-profile cases are crucial. Only by embracing these lessons can justice become more than a slogan and actually do what it's supposed to do. The Peterson case, far from closed, stays an urgent call to action, pushing reforms, vigilance, and humility while pursuing justice. The questions raised by the Peterson case continue to resonate because they reach beyond one courtroom and one verdict. They force us to ask whether every conviction is receiving the same level of scrutiny, especially when new evidence, evolving forensic techniques, or overlooked testimony emerge years later. Justice is not strengthened by refusing to revisit difficult cases. It is strengthened by the willingness to confront uncomfortable possibilities wherever they lead. Whether future reviews ultimately reinforce the original verdict or reveal critical mistakes, the process itself matters. It reminds the public that truth should never be considered untouchable simply because time has passed. The lasting legacy of this case may not rest solely on Scott Peterson or the tragic loss of Laci and Connor, but on whether the legal system proves capable of learning from its most controversial moments and ensuring that fairness remains the guiding principle above all else. In summary, the Laci Peterson case reveals deep flaws in evidence handling, media influence, and the justice system itself. This ongoing investigation challenges us to seek truth beyond appearances and calls for reform to protect the innocent. If you found this eye-opening, please like and subscribe for more videos that dig beneath the surface of the biggest cases.